The conference room felt too small for the silence that had settled inside it. Natalie Reed stood at the end of the polished walnut table, fingers pressed against the back of a chair, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The projector hummed softly, casting the logo she had spent 3 sleepless weeks designing onto the wall. Across from her sat a man in a faded plaid shirt, sun-weathered skin, and work boots that carried traces of Colorado dust. An hour earlier, she had refused to shake his hand. Now he was signing documents that identified him as the principal owner of the company financing the largest redevelopment project in downtown Denver that year. The room was quiet enough that Natalie could hear the scratch of his pen. And in that silence, she realized something terrifying. The mistake that could cost her everything had happened before the meeting had even begun. 3 weeks earlier, July in Denver had a way of making even the mornings feel exhausted. Natalie woke to the vibration of her phone on the nightstand. A client had sent revisions at 5:47 a.m., marked urgent, as if everyone else's life existed on standby for his schedule. She lay staring at the ceiling of her apartment in Capitol Hill, the kind of place that looked impressive in photos but consumed nearly half her paycheck every month. 32 years old, senior designer at one of Denver's most respected branding studios. Featured in regional design magazines. Invited to industry panels. Known for her minimalist aesthetic, tailored wardrobe, and the calm confidence she wore like a second skin. That was the version of Natalie everyone knew. The version they didn't know had grown up in a farming town outside Alamosa, where the nearest movie theater was 40 miles away, and everyone knew which truck belonged to which family. She had left at 18 with a scholarship, 2 suitcases, and a promise to herself that she would never sound, look, or feel small again. Her phone buzzed once more. A company-wide email appeared in her inbox. New project secured. Major mixed-use redevelopment. Full brand identity required. Investor requests in-person meeting with design team next week. Natalie sat up immediately. This was the kind of account that changed careers. She could already picture the portfolio spreads, the award submissions, the conversations that might finally move her into a creative director role. By the time she arrived at the studio that morning, the entire office was buzzing. I heard the investor made his money in agriculture, her co-worker Jenna said while pouring coffee in the kitchen. Some huge ranching and logistics operation on the western slope. Natalie gave a small shrug. As long as he pays on time and doesn't tell us to put cowboy hats in the logo, I'm fine with it. Jenna laughed. Natalie smiled too, but the joke carried more truth than humor. Anything that reminded her of the world she came from still made her uneasy. She had spent years sanding off every trace of it. Her accent, her habits, even the way she held a coffee mug. The investor meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday, and Natalie prepared for it with the intensity of someone studying for a final exam. She refined presentations late into the night, chose typography with surgical precision, bought a new cream-colored blazer she couldn't really afford because she wanted to look like someone who belonged in rooms where million-dollar decisions were made. 2 days before the meeting, she stayed late at the office alone, adjusting color palettes while the city darkened outside the windows. The studio's air conditioner had been malfunctioning for a week, leaving the space heavy with summer heat. That was when the man walked in. He looked to be in his late 50s. Plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled up, worn jeans, work boots, large hands roughened by years of physical labor. He paused just inside the open studio, glancing around as if searching for someone. Without looking up from her monitor, Natalie spoke first. If you're here for deliveries or building maintenance, reception is downstairs. The words came out automatically. Sharp, efficient, dismissive. The man stood still for a moment. Then he nodded once. Appreciated. And walked back out. Jenna looked up from her desk across the room. Natalie, do you know who that was? No, Natalie said, still clicking through design files. Someone who got off on the wrong floor. Jenna opened her mouth as if to say more, then stopped and returned to her screen. Natalie didn't notice the expression on her face. That evening, on her walk home, she stopped at a small grocery store. In front of her, an older woman counted coins slowly at the register while trying to pay for milk and bread. The cashier quietly added the missing amount herself. You can get me next time, Mrs. Carter. The woman smiled with embarrassed gratitude. For reasons Natalie couldn't explain, the scene made her chest tighten. It reminded her of home, of neighbors who lent tools without asking, of her mother sending extra vegetables to families having a hard year, of a world she had spent more than a decade trying to outgrow. That night, she called her parents for the first time in weeks. You should come visit before the peaches are gone, her mother said. Your dad keeps asking when you're coming home. Natalie stared out the kitchen window at the lights of the city. Work's crazy right now, Mom. Big project. There's always a big project, her mother replied gently. After they hung up, Natalie sat in silence for a long time, listening to the distant traffic and wondering why a simple invitation home felt harder to accept than any deadline she had ever faced. She didn't know it yet, but the man she had sent downstairs would walk into her conference room 48 hours later and change the way she saw herself forever. And when he did, the first thing he would remember was not her award-winning design work. It would be the way she had looked right through him. Wednesday arrived with one of those impossibly clear Colorado mornings that made the Rocky Mountains look close enough to touch. Natalie was at the studio before anyone else. She adjusted every chair in the conference room twice, straightened presentation boards that were already perfectly aligned, checked the projector, checked it again. She had rehearsed the presentation so many times that she could have delivered it in her sleep. Yet something about that man in the plaid shirt kept drifting back into her thoughts. Not because she felt guilty. Not yet. Mostly because Jenna's strange reaction 2 days earlier refused to leave her mind. At exactly 9:45 a.m., the rest of the creative team gathered around the long conference table. Their studio director, Daniel Mercer, walked in carrying a folder thick enough to suggest this project was even larger than they'd imagined. He looked unusually serious. "Before our guests arrive," he said, placing the folder on the table, "I want everyone to understand something. This development isn't just another commercial property. It's a long-term investment. It includes affordable housing, local businesses, public parks, community art spaces, and restoration of one of Denver's oldest warehouse districts." He paused. "Our client has made one request. He wants this place to feel like it belongs to everyone. Not just wealthy newcomers. Not just tourists. Everyone." Natalie liked that answer. It sounded sincere. Still, she pictured the investor as another billionaire in a tailored suit who hired consultants to sound compassionate. Daniel continued. "He's unconventional. He doesn't care about appearances. He asks direct questions. He expects honest answers. And don't mistake simplicity for lack of intelligence." Several people nodded. Natalie wrote the last sentence in her notebook. She assumed it was one of those things managers like to say before important meetings. At precisely 10 o'clock, the receptionist opened the conference room door. "Mr. Brooks is here." Everyone stood. Natalie adjusted the sleeve of her blazer and turned toward the entrance. The first person through the doorway was the same man she had dismissed 2 days earlier. Plaid shirt, weathered boots, sun-darkened skin, the same calm eyes. For a split second, her brain refused to process what she was seeing. Then Daniel stepped forward with a broad smile. "Richard Brooks. So glad you could make it." He shook the man's hand warmly. "It's an honor to finally meet in person." The room applauded politely. Natalie didn't move. Every sound around her seemed strangely distant. Richard Brooks, owner of Brooks Land and Infrastructure, lead investor, the man financing a project worth nearly $400 million, the man she had mistaken for maintenance staff. Richard greeted everyone individually. He smiled easily, asked people their names, remembered each one after hearing it only once. When he reached Natalie, he extended his hand. She hesitated, barely half a second, but long enough for both of them to notice. Then she forced a smile and shook it. "Nice to meet you." His grip was firm. "So we finally met properly." The sentence sounded perfectly polite, yet something inside it carried a meaning only the two of them understood. He remembered. Of course he remembered. Natalie felt heat rise into her face. The presentation began. Daniel introduced the project before handing control to Natalie. She stood, clicked the remote. The first slide appeared. Normally, presenting was where she felt strongest. Today, every sentence felt heavier than the last. She explained the visual identity, the architectural inspiration, the typography, the colors inspired by Colorado sandstone, alpine forests, and historic brick warehouses. Richard listened without interrupting. He never checked his phone, never whispered to his assistants. He simply watched, sometimes writing notes in a worn leather notebook instead of a tablet. That small detail somehow unsettled Natalie more than anything else. After nearly 40 minutes, she reached the final slide. Questions. Silence. Richard closed his notebook, folded his hands, then looked directly at her. His expression remained calm, almost curious. "I have one." Natalie's heartbeat accelerated. "When we first met earlier this week." He let the sentence hang for a moment. "What made you think I worked in building maintenance?" The room instantly became still. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for coffee. Nobody looked at their laptops. Daniel blinked. "I'm sorry, first met." Richard nodded without taking his eyes off Natalie. "I stopped by Monday afternoon. I wanted to see the studio before today's meeting. I prefer visiting places quietly. I learn more that way." Natalie's throat tightened. Daniel looked confused. "I wasn't told about that visit." "You weren't," Richard answered. "It wasn't scheduled." He smiled faintly. "I've learned over the years that people behave differently when they don't know who's watching." No one spoke. Richard continued gently. When I walked in, Ms. Reed directed me to the front desk because she assumed I didn't belong upstairs. There was no anger in his voice. No accusation. Just facts. And somehow, that made them impossible to argue with. Daniel slowly turned toward Natalie. His expression wasn't furious. It was disappointed. Natalie. Every instinct told her to explain. To say she'd been busy. Distracted. Focused on work. But none of those things were actually true. She had judged him before looking up. She knew it. And now everyone else did too. Richard leaned back in his chair. I'm not asking because I want an apology. He spoke quietly enough that everyone leaned in to hear. I'm asking because the answer matters. If someone designing a place that's supposed to welcome every member of a community decides who belongs based on appearance. He paused. Then we're building the wrong kind of place. The sentence landed harder than any public humiliation could have, because nobody could disagree with it. Natalie opened her mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time in her professional life, she had absolutely no idea what to say. The silence in the conference room stretched for what felt like minutes. No one looked at the presentation anymore. The carefully crafted mood boards, color palettes, and architectural renderings had suddenly become irrelevant. Natalie could feel every pair of eyes in the room drifting toward her. Daniel finally cleared his throat. Maybe this is just a misunderstanding. Richard raised a hand politely. I don't think it is. His voice remained calm. I've spent 30 years walking into rooms where people decide who I am before I introduce myself. He smiled, not bitterly, but with the quiet acceptance of someone who had grown used to it. Sometimes they think I'm the contractor. Sometimes the truck driver. Sometimes security asks who I'm delivering packages for. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the table. But every once in a while, Richard continued, those moments tell me more about a company than any presentation ever could. He looked toward Daniel. I'd appreciate 10 minutes alone with Ms. Reed. The request surprised everyone. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Within moments, the room emptied. The heavy conference door clicked shut. Now only 3 people remained. Richard, Natalie, and Daniel. The silence returned. Only the quiet hum of the projector filled the room. Richard folded his notebook closed. I'm not here to embarrass you. Natalie finally found her voice. I'm sorry. The words sounded small. Incomplete. He nodded once. I believe you are. But that's not what interests me. He leaned forward slightly. I'd like to understand why. Natalie stared down at her hands. The easy answer would have been stress. Long hours. Deadlines. Anyone would believe it. Instead, she found herself saying something she had never admitted aloud. Because. She stopped. The words refused to come. Richard waited patiently. No rush. She took a slow breath. I grew up in a farming town. Another pause. I spent years trying to erase every sign of it. She laughed once. It wasn't really laughter. More like disbelief. I changed the way I talked. The clothes I wore. The places I went. I stopped visiting home. I even stopped mentioning where I grew up. Daniel looked at her with genuine surprise. You did? Natalie nodded without lifting her eyes. No one here knows. Richard remained quiet. So she kept talking. When I first moved to Denver, I heard people make jokes. They weren't cruel. Just little comments. You don't sound like you're from around here. Cute accent. Country girl figured out Photoshop. She forced another smile. Everyone laughed. So did I. But after enough years, you start believing that if people discover where you're really from, they'll stop taking you seriously. Her voice had become almost a whisper. When I saw you, she finally looked at Richard. I didn't see you. The room stayed quiet. Daniel slowly sat down. He had worked beside Natalie for nearly 7 years. Yet somehow, he realized he had never actually known her. Richard nodded thoughtfully. That's more honest than I expected. It doesn't excuse what happened. I know. No. He smiled gently. It doesn't. Another long silence settled between them. Then Richard stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Denver. Construction cranes filled the skyline. New buildings rising beside century-old brick warehouses. When I first came here, he said quietly, still looking outside, I slept in my pickup for nearly 3 months. Natalie blinked. I couldn't afford an apartment. I hauled fencing during the day, delivered hay at night, saved every dollar. When winter came, I showered at truck stops. Daniel stared at him. You've never mentioned any of this. Richard shrugged. Most people never ask. He smiled faintly. And honestly, I don't need them to. Do you know who taught me my first business lesson? She shook her head. A carpenter. He couldn't read blueprints very well, but he could walk into an empty field and tell you exactly where a building would settle after 20 years of snow. Richard chuckled softly. I thought I was smarter than he was. I had the college classes, the spreadsheets, the fancy words. He had 40 years of experience. It took me about 6 months to realize I wasn't the teacher. I was the student. He stepped closer. The best people I've worked with over the years have looked nothing alike. Some wore tailored suits. Some drove rusted pickups. Some had graduate degrees. Others never finished high school. The only thing they had in common was character. Natalie felt something inside her begin to crack. Not dramatically. Not all at once. More like a wall that had been under pressure for years. Richard studied her quietly. I don't think you're a bad person. She looked surprised. I think you're afraid. The sentence hit harder than anything else he had said. Because it was true. Not afraid of Richard. Afraid of becoming the girl she'd once been. Afraid someone would hear traces of her hometown in her voice. Afraid that everything she'd built could disappear if people discovered where she'd started. Richard picked up his notebook. I haven't decided whether this company gets my project. Daniel started to speak. Richard shook his head gently. This isn't about punishment. It's about trust. He looked at Natalie one last time. You design places where strangers are supposed to feel welcome. If you can't see people before you see their clothes, then no amount of beautiful branding will fix that. He walked toward the door. His hand rested briefly on the handle. Oh, he smiled. My mother still lives on the ranch. She'd probably like your mother. Then he left. The door closed softly behind him. Natalie remained frozen in her chair. Daniel didn't speak for almost a full minute. Finally, he sighed. I've managed creative teams for 22 years. I've seen missed deadlines, lost clients, design disasters. But I've never watched someone lose a project before the real work even started. Natalie swallowed. I know. Daniel rubbed his forehead. I have to inform the board. I don't know what happens next. Neither did she. As she left the conference room, the giant logo she had designed was still glowing on the screen behind her. For the first time, it didn't feel like something she had created. It felt like a reminder of the person she had been pretending to become. And outside the studio windows, the Denver skyline looked exactly the same. Only Natalie knew that her entire future had quietly shifted in the space of one conversation. By the following morning, everyone in the studio knew that something had happened. No one knew every detail. They didn't have to. Creative offices had a way of turning silence into rumors faster than words ever could. People lowered their voices when Natalie walked past. Conversations stopped a second too early. Someone who usually invited her to lunch suddenly already had plans. No one was openly cruel. Somehow, that made it worse. The distance was polite, professional, carefully measured. Exactly the kind of distance Natalie herself had spent years creating between herself and people she believed didn't belong. Now she was standing on the other side of it. For the first time, she understood how cold it felt. Daniel called her into his office late that afternoon. He looked exhausted. His jacket hung over the back of his chair, and 3 untouched cups of coffee sat on his desk. I spoke with the board. Natalie nodded. She had expected this. They're nervous. I understand. So do I. Daniel leaned back. No decision has been made. But if Richard Brooks walks away, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Losing a project that size wouldn't just hurt the company. It would affect bonuses, hiring, future clients, possibly jobs. Natalie stared at the floor. I'm sorry. Daniel sighed. I believe that. Then he looked at her carefully. But here's what I need to know. Who have you been trying so hard to become? The question caught her completely off guard. I don't. Yes, you do. He folded his hands. You've worked here almost 7 years. You've never talked about your family. You never take vacations. You've skipped every holiday party. You work harder than anyone. And somehow, you always seem afraid that if you stop moving, someone will discover something. Natalie felt tears threatening for the first time in years. She blinked them away. I just wanted people to respect me. Daniel nodded slowly. Respect doesn't come from pretending. It comes from consistency. He smiled sadly. I wish someone had told you that sooner. That evening, Natalie drove instead of taking the light rail. She had nowhere specific to go. She simply drove west until the city lights began giving way to open roads. Eventually, she pulled into a scenic overlook where the Front Range stretched across the horizon. The mountains were turning gold in the setting sun. She remembered being 16, sitting in the bed of her father's old pickup after baling hay, watching sunsets almost identical to this one. Back then, she couldn't wait to leave. She believed the city would erase every insecurity she'd ever had. Instead, she had carried them with her, only dressed them in better clothes. Her phone rang. Mom. She almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, she answered. Hey, sweetheart. Her mother's voice carried the same warmth it always had. You sound tired. Natalie smiled weakly. I've had a rough week. There was a pause. Then her mother said something unexpected. Do you remember Mr. Ellison? Natalie frowned. The mechanic? The one who fixed Dad's tractors? Yes. He passed away yesterday. Natalie's heart sank. She hadn't seen him in almost 15 years. He used to tell everyone. Her mother laughed softly. That you were going to design buildings in New York. Natalie smiled despite herself. I wanted to. He was proud of you. I barely knew him. Didn't matter. He talked about you anyway. Silence settled between them. Then her mother spoke again. You know, we've never been ashamed that you left. We've only been sad that you stopped coming back. Natalie closed her eyes. The words landed deeper than any criticism ever could. I'm sorry. I know. Just come home when you're ready. That weekend, Natalie drove south. Nearly 4 hours. Past Colorado Springs. Past Pueblo. Past wide-open ranch land that looked exactly like the landscapes she'd spent years pretending not to remember. The welcome sign for her hometown had faded paint now. The grocery store looked smaller. The grain elevator somehow looked bigger. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Her parents' ranch sat exactly where it always had. Her father was repairing a fence when she pulled in. He looked older. His hair almost completely gray, but the smile on his face hadn't changed at all. Well, he wiped his hands on his jeans. Would you look who's finally home? No lectures. No guilt. Just happiness. That somehow hurt the most. Her mother hugged her so tightly that Natalie almost started crying again. Inside the house, everything smelled exactly as she remembered. Fresh bread. Coffee. Pine cleaner. Home. That evening they ate dinner on the porch. No phones. No deadlines. No presentations. Just conversation. Her father talked about rainfall. Her mother complained about deer eating tomatoes. Neighbors waved as they drove past. It was painfully ordinary and strangely comforting. After dinner, Natalie wandered into the old barn. Dust floated through beams of evening sunlight. An old corkboard still hung on the wall, covered with ribbons. School certificates. Photos. One picture caught her attention. She was 12 years old, standing beside a county art competition display, holding first place. Her father stood behind her, beaming with pride. On the back of the photo, someone had written in black marker, "Never forget where your hands first learned to create." She recognized the handwriting immediately. Her father's. Natalie sat down on an old wooden crate. For years, she had believed leaving home meant becoming someone new. Looking around that quiet barn, she finally understood something. She hadn't escaped her past. She had been running from people who had never once asked her to run. The realization stayed with her all the way back to Denver. But she still didn't know whether it had come too late. Because waiting in her inbox Monday morning was an email from Richard Brooks. Only 2 sentences. I'd like to meet with you. Tomorrow, 11 o'clock. Just the 2 of us. Natalie stared at the screen for nearly a full minute. She had expected many things. A lawsuit. A cancellation. A formal complaint. She had never expected another chance to explain herself. Natalie barely slept that night. She wasn't afraid of losing her job anymore. That possibility had already settled somewhere in the back of her mind. What frightened her now was something else. She had no idea why Richard Brooks wanted to see her. People rarely asked for private meetings after being insulted. Most simply walked away. Others let their attorneys handle it. Richard had done neither. The next morning she arrived 20 minutes early. The cafe he had chosen sat on a quiet corner a block away from the studio. It wasn't trendy. There were no exposed brick walls, handcrafted neon signs, or influencers taking pictures of latte art. It was the kind of neighborhood coffee shop where construction workers, nurses, retirees, and office employees all stood in the same line without anyone paying much attention to who was wearing what. Natalie noticed that immediately. She wondered if Richard had chosen it on purpose. He was already there. A mug of black tea rested in front of him. Not coffee. Tea. He looked up as she approached. Good morning, Natalie. His voice carried no trace of resentment. Thank you for coming. She sat down. Neither of them spoke for a few moments. The waitress brought water. Richard thanked her by name. Apparently, he had been there often enough to remember it. Another small detail. Another reminder that he noticed people most others overlooked. Finally, he folded his hands. I'll save us both some suspense. Natalie looked at him. I've decided to move forward with your studio. She blinked. You have. I have. Relief rushed through her body so suddenly that she almost forgot to breathe. But Richard wasn't finished. I do have one condition. The relief disappeared just as quickly. I'm listening. I want you to remain lead designer. Natalie stared at him. I'm sorry. I don't understand. I know. He smiled slightly. Neither did my business partners when I told them. She frowned. Why would you want the person who offended you leading the project? Richard leaned back. Because removing you would be easy. Watching you change. That's much harder. Natalie remained silent. I've spent decades hiring people, Richard continued. I've learned something. There are two kinds of mistakes. He held up one finger. The first comes from arrogance. He raised another. The second comes from fear. The first rarely changes. The second sometimes does. He looked directly into her eyes. I've been trying to decide which one yours was. She didn't answer immediately, because she wasn't entirely sure herself. Richard reached into his worn leather bag and removed a thin folder. Inside were photographs. Not of office buildings. Not of financial reports. Communities. Neighborhoods. Children playing. Local markets. Old brick storefronts. Families sitting in public parks. This project isn't about architecture. He spread the photos across the table. It's about trust. He pointed to one picture showing an elderly man sitting beside a young mother while both watch children play. They've probably never spoken, but they still have to feel like this space belongs to both of them. Another photograph. Teenagers skateboarding near business professionals eating lunch outdoors. Another. A mechanic reading a newspaper beside a university professor. Design can't create kindness, Richard said quietly, but it can make people feel welcome. He paused. And people who design welcoming places have to understand what exclusion feels like. Natalie swallowed. I think. She hesitated. I'm only beginning to. Richard nodded. I believe that. Another silence settled over the table. Comfortable this time. Finally, Natalie asked the question that had been sitting in her mind since receiving the email. Why are you giving me this opportunity? He smiled. Because someone once did the same for me. He looked toward the cafe window as if watching a memory instead of the street outside. I was 26. I had just started my first construction company. I showed up to meet a developer wearing borrowed dress shoes that were 2 sizes too small. Natalie smiled despite herself. I spent the entire meeting pretending they didn't hurt. He laughed quietly. I'm sure everyone noticed. What happened? The developer asked where I learned business. Richard shrugged. I said I hadn't. I'd learned to repair irrigation systems. I expected him to end the meeting. He didn't. What did he do? He hired me. Natalie looked surprised. Why? Richard smiled. He said, I can teach contracts. I can't teach integrity. The words hung between them. I've never forgotten that. He looked back at Natalie. So this isn't forgiveness. She felt her chest tighten. It's an opportunity. A test. You'll be working directly with me for the next year. I'll be paying attention. Not to your presentations. Not to your design work. To how you treat people. Natalie nodded slowly. Richard continued. If I ever see you dismiss someone because of their clothes, their accent, their education, or the job they do, I'll end our partnership immediately. No discussion. No second meeting. No explanation. She held his gaze. I understand. No. Richard smiled kindly. I don't think you do. She frowned slightly. This isn't about protecting me. It's about protecting every person you'll meet after me. That sentence stayed with her long after the conversation moved on. Before they left, Richard stood and walked toward the counter. Natalie assumed he was paying. Instead, he carried 2 empty cups back to the register. The young employee behind the counter looked embarrassed. Oh, sir, I can get those. Richard smiled. I know. But my legs still work. He thanked her again. Asked how college was going. Wished her luck on her exams. Outside, Natalie watched the employee smile long after they had walked away. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No speeches. No applause. Just simple respect. And somehow, it taught Natalie more than every conversation they'd had that morning. As they reached the sidewalk, Richard stopped. The groundbreaking ceremony is next month. I'd like you there. I'll be there. I know. He smiled. The question isn't whether you'll show up. It's who you'll be when you do. Natalie watched him climb into an aging blue pickup truck with nearly 200,000 miles on it. She stood there for a long time after he drove away. For years, she had believed success looked like expensive cars, luxury apartments, designer clothes, perfect introductions. Richard Brooks had quietly dismantled every one of those assumptions. And the hardest part wasn't realizing she had judged him. It was realizing how many other people she had never truly seen. People often imagine change as a single dramatic moment. One conversation, one apology, one life-changing realization. But real change rarely works that way. It is quieter, slower, and much more uncomfortable. For Natalie, it began on an ordinary Tuesday morning. She stepped into the studio carrying coffee and nearly walked past Luis, the overnight janitor, without acknowledging him. She had done it hundreds of times before. Not intentionally. At least, that's what she had always told herself. This time she stopped. "Morning, Luis." The older man looked surprised. Then he smiled. "Morning, Miss Reed." She almost kept walking. Instead, she noticed the heavy trash bags he was struggling to lift. "Need a hand?" Luis laughed. "You sure? Why not?" Together, they carried the bags to the service elevator. It took less than 2 minutes. When she returned upstairs, Jenna looked at her curiously. "I've never seen you do that before." Natalie smiled awkwardly. "I've never noticed before." The project moved quickly. Every week brought new meetings with architects, engineers, neighborhood organizations, city planners, and local business owners. Richard attended almost every one of them. Not because he needed to, because he wanted to listen. Natalie noticed something unusual. Whenever someone entered the room, Richard greeted them exactly the same way. The city official, the intern, the electrician, the receptionist bringing fresh coffee. There was no difference. No invisible ranking system. Everyone received the same attention, the same eye contact, the same respect. Natalie began watching him more carefully, not because she admired him. Not yet. Because she was trying to understand him. One afternoon, the team visited the old warehouse district that would soon become the redevelopment site. The buildings were worn. Broken windows reflected the afternoon sun. Brick walls carried decades of faded advertisements. Most people saw abandoned structures. Richard saw possibility. He walked slowly through the neighborhood, stopping every few minutes to greet local shop owners. A barber stepped outside. Richard knew his name. An elderly woman watering flowers waved from her bakery. Richard waved back. A mechanic working under an old pickup truck called out, "Morning, Rich." Richard grinned. "Morning, Frank." Natalie finally asked the question she'd been wondering about. "You know everyone." Richard chuckled. "No, I remember everyone. There's a difference." Later that afternoon, they gathered in a temporary project office overlooking the site. An intern named Ethan was presenting updated traffic flow diagrams. He had joined the company only 3 weeks earlier. Halfway through his presentation, he became flustered. One of the charts contained outdated numbers. Daniel sighed. A few people exchanged impatient looks. Ethan's face turned bright red. "I'm sorry. I used the wrong spreadsheet." Natalie felt the familiar impulse rise inside her. The old version of herself wanted to interrupt. Correct him. Move the meeting forward. Instead, she remembered sitting across from Richard in the cafe, watching him thank the waitress by name. She took a slow breath. "It's okay." Everyone looked toward her. "Take your time." Ethan blinked. "I can pull up the correct version." No rush. Within 30 seconds, he found the right file. The presentation continued smoothly. After the meeting, Ethan caught up with her in the hallway. "Thanks." She looked confused. "For what?" "For not making me feel stupid." Natalie smiled. "I've made enough mistakes lately." He laughed. "So have I." As he walked away, she realized something. That tiny moment had required far more effort than presenting to a boardroom full of executives. Not every day went that well. A week later, one of the junior designers accidentally sent outdated artwork to a contractor. The mistake delayed production by almost 2 days. Natalie felt frustration surge through her. Without thinking, she snapped. "Did anyone actually review this before sending it?" The room fell silent. The young designer lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry. I thought. You thought wrong." The words came out harsher than Natalie intended. She saw the expression on the young woman's face. Embarrassment. The same expression she had worn in Richard's conference room. Hours later, long after everyone had gone home, Natalie was still thinking about it. She walked over to the junior designer's desk. There was a small sticky note beside the monitor. "First big project. Don't mess this up." Natalie stared at the note. She remembered writing almost the exact same sentence in one of her college sketchbooks years ago. The next morning, she knocked gently on the designer's office door. "Can we talk?" The young woman looked nervous. "I owe you an apology." The designer blinked. "You made a mistake." "I've made plenty. I shouldn't have made you feel smaller because of it." Silence. Then the younger woman smiled. "I'll double-check everything next time." "I know you will." That conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Yet somehow, it felt like one of the most important meetings Natalie had attended all year. Outside of work, other things were changing too. She started calling her parents every Wednesday instead of once every few months. Sometimes the conversations lasted 5 minutes, sometimes an hour. She learned that her father had finally replaced the old tractor, that her mother had joined the local library board, that the peach trees behind the barn had survived a late frost. Small things. Ordinary things. Things she once believed she had outgrown. Now, she found herself looking forward to hearing them. One Saturday, she drove home again. Not because she felt guilty, simply because she wanted to. Her father was repairing a fence when she arrived. "You know," he said with a grin, "you don't have to wait for something bad to happen before visiting." She laughed. "I'm figuring that out." That evening they sat on the porch watching the sunset spread across the fields. Her father pointed toward the horizon. "You spent years trying to leave this place." Natalie nodded. "I know." He smiled without looking at her. "We never wanted you to stay. We just hoped you wouldn't forget where you learned how to work." She looked across the ranch, at the weathered barn, the open fields, the mountains in the distance. For the first time, none of it felt like something she needed to hide. Back in Denver, the redevelopment project continued to grow. The groundbreaking ceremony was only weeks away. The media would be there. City officials, investors, community leaders, and Richard Brooks had quietly been watching everything, just as he promised. Natalie wasn't sure whether she was passing his test, but she did know one thing. The hardest part had never been earning back Richard's trust. It had been earning back her own. By early autumn, the old warehouse district looked completely different. Construction fences surrounded the site. Tower cranes stretched across the Denver skyline. Concrete foundations had replaced empty lots. For the first time in decades, people believed that this forgotten part of the city might actually have a future. The groundbreaking ceremony was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a bright September morning. Television crews arrived early. Local newspapers set up cameras. City officials greeted investors, while volunteers handed out coffee and breakfast sandwiches to guests. Natalie stood near the temporary stage wearing a navy blue blazer instead of the cream-colored suit she had worn the day she first met Richard Brooks. That outfit still hung in the back of her closet. She hadn't worn it since. Not because there was anything wrong with the blazer, but because every time she saw it, she remembered the person she had been inside it. Daniel walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You look nervous." Natalie accepted one. "I am." He smiled. "You've presented in front of 500 people before." "I know. This feels different." "It is different." Daniel nodded toward the crowd gathering near the stage. "Today isn't about presentations. It's about people." She knew exactly what he meant. Richard arrived 10 minutes before the ceremony, driving the same aging blue pickup. No security convoy. No luxury SUV. No entourage. He parked in the same gravel lot as everyone else. Before walking toward the stage, he stopped to help 2 volunteers unload folding chairs from a trailer. Neither of them appeared to recognize him. To them, he looked like another contractor lending a hand. Natalie watched from across the lot. A year ago, she probably would have assumed the same thing. Now, she noticed something entirely different. The volunteers smiled while talking with him. Not because of his position, because he made them feel noticed. The ceremony began. The mayor welcomed everyone. Community leaders spoke about restoring neighborhoods instead of replacing them. Architects presented renderings of parks, housing, and local businesses. Finally, Daniel introduced Richard. This project exists because one person believed abandoned buildings could become the heart of a community again. Applause filled the site. Richard stepped to the microphone. He looked out over hundreds of people. Construction workers, teachers, reporters, families, college students, retirees. Instead of beginning with numbers or investment figures, he smiled. "When I bought my first truck," the audience laughed softly. "It was older than I was." More laughter. "I thought success meant replacing it as fast as possible." He glanced toward his pickup parked in the distance. "Turns out, I was wrong." People smiled. "I've learned that success isn't measured by what you drive, or where you came from. It's measured by how many doors stay open after you've walked through them." Natalie felt those words settle somewhere deep inside her. Richard continued. "This neighborhood deserves more than beautiful buildings. It deserves respect. So does every person who walks through it." His speech lasted less than 10 minutes, yet it received the longest applause of the morning. Not because it was dramatic, because it felt genuine. After the ceremony, reporters spread across the construction site interviewing city officials and project leaders. Natalie was reviewing branding materials with the marketing team when she noticed a small commotion near one of the equipment trailers. A delivery driver stood beside a pallet of printed signage. He looked frustrated. A volunteer wearing an event badge blocked his path. "I'm sorry. Only authorized personnel beyond this point." The driver held up paperwork. "I've got the signs for the ceremony. They're already late." "I understand. But these are the rules." People nearby had begun watching. The driver sighed. "Can someone please get whoever ordered these?" The volunteer looked overwhelmed. Natalie started walking toward them. Halfway there, she stopped. Someone else had already arrived. "Richard." He listened quietly for less than 30 seconds, then smiled. "Morning." The driver nodded. "Morning." Richard looked at the volunteer. You're doing exactly what you were asked to do. The young volunteer immediately looked relieved. Then Richard turned toward the driver. And you've got people waiting on your delivery. He picked up one end of the pallet himself. Let's solve both problems. Within moments, the signs were unloaded. The volunteer thanked the driver. The driver thanked the volunteer. Both thanked Richard. No raised voices. No embarrassment. No one left feeling small. Natalie stood silently a few yards away. She realized something. Leadership wasn't about having authority. It was about making sure nobody had to lose for someone else to win. An hour later, as the crowd began thinning out, Richard found Natalie near the edge of the construction site. You've been observing again. She smiled. I guess I have. What did you learn today? She looked toward the volunteers folding chairs. The person who looked the most important wasn't the one standing on the stage. Richard laughed quietly. That's a good answer. But not the one I was hoping for. She frowned. What were you hoping I'd say? He pointed toward the delivery driver, who was now shaking hands with the volunteer before leaving. I hoped you'd notice that neither of them cared who I was. They only cared whether someone treated them fairly. Natalie nodded slowly. I did notice. Richard smiled. Good. He looked around the construction site one more time. When these buildings are finished, people won't remember the logo. They probably won't remember my speech either. They'll remember how this place made them feel. He looked back at Natalie. And that's true of people, too. Before she could answer, Daniel called her over for another interview. As she walked away, Natalie glanced back. Richard had already taken off his suit jacket. A group of construction workers was struggling to move heavy barricades. Without saying a word, he stepped in beside them and started lifting. No cameras pointed in his direction. No reporters were watching anymore. There was no audience left to impress. And somehow, Natalie thought, that was exactly why it mattered. Winter arrived earlier than expected. By November, the mountains west of Denver were already covered in snow, and icy winds swept through the construction site almost every morning. The redevelopment project was moving ahead of schedule. Steel frames stretched toward the gray sky. The first retail spaces had begun taking shape. Inside the studio, deadlines became tighter than ever. Yet something had quietly changed. People smiled more. The tension that usually filled large projects had softened. Natalie wasn't sure exactly when it happened. Perhaps it was because she had stopped trying to prove herself every minute of every day. Or maybe, people simply trusted someone who no longer felt the need to appear perfect. One Monday morning, Daniel walked into the creative studio carrying a stack of resumes. We're hiring another junior designer. He placed the folders on the conference table. I'd like Natalie to conduct the final interviews. She looked surprised. Me? Daniel nodded. I think you're ready. The words carried more meaning than anyone else in the room realized. A year ago, Natalie would have been excited. Now, she felt nervous, because she remembered exactly how easily first impressions could become permanent. The interviews lasted most of the afternoon. Some candidates arrived in expensive suits with polished portfolios. Others came dressed casually. One applicant spoke confidently. Another barely looked up from the table. Near the end of the day, the receptionist knocked gently. Your last interview is here. A young man stepped inside. He couldn't have been older than 23. His blazer was clearly borrowed. The sleeves were slightly too long. His shoes had been polished carefully, but years of wear still showed through. He apologized before even sitting down. I'm sorry. My GPS took me to the wrong building. Natalie smiled. No problem. She noticed him relaxing almost immediately. Daniel quietly observed from the corner without saying anything. The interview began. At first, the young man stumbled over his answers. Then Natalie asked about his portfolio. Everything changed. His eyes lit up. He spoke with genuine excitement about typography, color theory, accessibility, and community-focused design. He wasn't polished, but he was talented. When the interview ended, he gathered his portfolio carefully. I know I'm probably not your strongest candidate. Natalie looked at him. What makes you say that? He laughed awkwardly. I grew up on a cattle ranch outside Gunnison. I didn't attend an art school like most designers. I've always felt a little. He searched for the word. Behind. Natalie recognized that feeling immediately. She remembered carrying it herself for years. She stood and extended her hand. I think you'd fit in here just fine. His smile reached his eyes. After he left, Daniel closed the interview folder. So, Natalie didn't hesitate. He's the one I'd hire. Daniel smiled knowingly. I agree. Then he asked quietly, would you have made the same decision last year? Natalie looked out the window. Snow had begun falling over downtown Denver. She thought about the question for a long moment. Finally, no. Daniel nodded. I know. A few weeks later, the young designer, his name was Caleb, joined the studio. His first day was almost painful to watch. He apologized constantly, second-guessed every decision, asked permission before making even the smallest adjustment. Natalie recognized the fear immediately. Not fear of failure. Fear of not belonging. One afternoon, she stopped by his desk. "Walk with me." He looked confused but followed her onto the rooftop terrace. The city stretched beneath them. Construction cranes dotted the skyline. "You know," Natalie began, "when I started my career, I spent years pretending to be someone else." Caleb looked surprised. "You?" She laughed softly. "Hard to believe now." "A little." She nodded. "I thought success meant hiding where I came from." "What happened?" She smiled. "I met someone who reminded me that pretending is exhausting." Caleb leaned against the railing. "My dad always says, people who know who they are don't spend much time proving it." Natalie smiled. "He sounds like a smart man. He fixes tractors." So did mine. For a second, they simply looked at each other. Then both laughed. Not because it was funny, because it felt unexpectedly familiar. Later that week, Richard visited the studio for a design review. As the meeting ended, Caleb accidentally bumped into him while carrying presentation boards. Several boards slipped from his hands and scattered across the floor. "I'm so sorry." Caleb knelt immediately to pick them up. Before he could reach them, Richard was already helping. "No harm done. I should have been watching where I was going." Caleb looked horrified. "No, sir." Richard handed him the last board. "What's your name?" "Caleb." "First project?" "Yes." Richard smiled. "You'll remember this one." As Richard walked away, Caleb turned to Natalie. "I can't believe he helped me." Natalie smiled knowingly. "I can." That evening, after most employees had gone home, Richard stopped by Natalie's office. He glanced at Caleb's empty desk. "Good hire." Natalie looked up. "You noticed?" "I notice everyone." She laughed. "I've learned." Richard nodded. "I've been watching you too." Her heart skipped. He continued before she could speak. "The way you handled him today wasn't something you rehearsed." "No. It was instinct." She smiled. "I guess that's new." "It is." Richard looked around the quiet office. "You remember what I told you in the cafe? I said I'd be watching your actions." Natalie nodded. "I remember every word." He smiled. "I don't need to watch anymore." She stared at him. "You've already answered the question." "What question?" "The one I asked myself after our first meeting. Can someone truly change after discovering the worst part of themselves?" Natalie felt emotion rise unexpectedly. "What was your answer?" Richard smiled. "They can, but only if they stop changing for other people and start changing for themselves." He placed a small envelope on her desk. "Open it tomorrow morning." Before she could ask what it was, he had already walked out. Natalie looked at the envelope for a long time. There was no company logo, no return address, only her name, written neatly by hand. She had no idea that what waited inside would become the final piece of a journey that had begun with one careless sentence, spoken to a man in a plaid shirt. Natalie left the envelope untouched. It sat on the corner of her desk all afternoon, then all evening. She even carried it home without opening it. Part of her was curious. Another part was afraid. Over the past year, every conversation with Richard Brooks had changed something inside her. She wasn't sure she was ready for one more. The next morning, she arrived at the office before sunrise. The studio was quiet. Outside, fresh snow covered the sidewalks of downtown Denver, softening the sounds of the waking city. She placed a cup of coffee beside the envelope and finally opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter. Nothing more. She unfolded it carefully. "Natalie, if you're reading this, it means I've already made my decision. Not about the project. About you. When I first walked into your office, I saw someone who had become successful by working incredibly hard. I also saw someone who was carrying a burden no promotion could ever remove. Fear. Fear that if people discovered where you came from, they would think less of you. I know that fear because I carried it myself for many years. The difference is that I eventually realized something. The people worth impressing were never asking me to hide. Only I was. Don't waste another decade trying to earn acceptance from people who have never questioned your value. You'll never meet them. The real challenge is accepting yourself before anyone else has the chance to." Richard. Natalie read the letter twice. Then a third time. By the time she folded it again, her coffee had gone cold. She placed the letter back into the envelope. Not because she was finished with it, because she knew she would read it many more times. December brought the final design presentation before construction entered its next phase. City officials, investors, community organizations, local business owners. Everyone gathered in the same conference room where, nearly a year earlier, Natalie had watched her world fall apart. Walking inside felt strangely surreal. The polished walnut table hadn't changed. Neither had the projector. Even the same mountain skyline stretched beyond the windows. Only Natalie was different. As guests began arriving, she greeted each person personally. Not because someone had told her to, because she genuinely wanted them to feel welcome. An elderly maintenance worker entered carrying extra extension cords. Natalie stood immediately. "Can I help you with those?" The man smiled. "I've got it." She carried half of them anyway. Across the room, Richard noticed. He didn't say a word. He simply smiled to himself. The presentation lasted almost 2 hours. When it ended, applause filled the room. The project had officially received final approval. Construction would continue through the next year exactly as planned. Daniel looked relieved. The architects celebrated. City officials shook hands. Reporters gathered for interviews. As the room slowly emptied, Daniel approached Natalie. "I've got something to tell you." She smiled. "If it's another presentation." He laughed. "No. It's about your future." She looked at him curiously. "The board met yesterday." Her heartbeat quickened. "They unanimously approved your promotion." Natalie blinked. "Promotion?" Daniel nodded. "Associate Creative Director." For a moment she couldn't speak. Not because she hadn't dreamed about hearing those words. She had. For years. But now, they somehow felt less important than they once had. Daniel noticed her expression. "That's not the reaction I expected." She smiled. "A year ago, this would have been everything. And now?" She looked around the room. Construction workers were laughing with architects. Interns were talking to city officials. Richard was helping fold presentation easels instead of posing for photographs. Now it just feels like she searched for the right words. Another responsibility. Daniel grinned. "Then you're probably ready." Later that afternoon, Natalie found Richard standing alone on the rooftop terrace overlooking the construction site. Snowflakes drifted slowly through the cold air. The skyline looked almost peaceful. She walked beside him. "I read your letter. I figured you would. You knew I'd wait to open it." Richard smiled. "I was hoping you would." She laughed softly. "You know people surprisingly well. I pay attention." They stood quietly for a while. Finally, Natalie asked, "Did you ever regret giving me another chance?" Richard thought for a moment. "No, not once. Even after everything. Especially after everything." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because people who never admit they're wrong rarely become better." He looked toward the city below. "You admitted it. You faced it. Then you did the hardest part. You changed without asking anyone to applaud you for it." The words stayed with her. Not because they felt like praise. Because they felt earned. As Richard prepared to leave, he stopped beside the elevator. "Oh, one more thing." She looked up. "I never told you why I visited the studio before our first meeting." "I wondered about that." He smiled. "I wanted to see whether the company I was investing in treated unknown people the same way they treated important ones." Natalie nodded slowly. "And I failed." He looked at her kindly. "No, you failed that day. They're not always the same thing." The elevator doors opened. Richard stepped inside. Before they closed, he added one final sentence. "The best chapters in life usually begin right after the pages we'd rather tear out." Then he disappeared. Natalie stood alone on the rooftop, watching snow fall over the city. A year earlier, she had believed success meant never making a mistake. Now she understood something completely different. Success wasn't avoiding failure. It was refusing to let failure become your identity. And she still had one conversation left to have. The one she had postponed for far too many years. Christmas arrived with heavy snow across southern Colorado. For the first time in nearly 15 years. Natalie wasn't going home because she felt guilty. She was going because she wanted to. The drive south from Denver felt different now. The mountains gave way to open valleys. Frozen fields stretched toward the horizon. Old barns stood quietly beneath fresh snow. None of it embarrassed her anymore. Instead, it felt familiar, comforting. As she turned onto the gravel road leading to her parents' ranch, she noticed something she had never paid attention to before. The fence her father had repaired all those years. The windmill still turning slowly. The porch light already glowing, even though it was still daylight. Her mother had always turned it on early, just in case someone comes home. Natalie smiled. This time, someone had. Her father stepped outside before she even parked the car. "You're early. I figured I'd surprise you." He laughed. "You think your mother hasn't been looking out that window every 10 minutes since breakfast?" The front door flew open. Her mother hurried across the porch and wrapped her in a hug. "You're freezing." "I'm fine." "Nonsense. Come inside." Some things never changed. And Natalie was suddenly grateful for that. The house smelled exactly as it always had. Fresh cinnamon, roasted turkey, pine branches, old wooden furniture warmed by decades of family gatherings. On the dining room wall hung the same photographs she had grown up seeing. School plays, county fairs, fishing trips, birthday parties. For years she had barely looked at them. Now she found herself stopping in front of each one. Her mother noticed. "I've been meaning to organize those." Natalie shook her head. Don't. They're perfect. That evening, after dinner, her father handed her an old cardboard box. I found this in the attic. Inside were sketchbooks, hundreds of drawings, old logos she had invented as a teenager, storefront ideas, magazine covers, restaurant signs, even cereal box redesigns. She laughed. I can't believe you kept all of these. Her father looked genuinely confused. Why wouldn't I? I thought. She stopped. What? I don't know. I guess I thought nobody cared. Her father smiled. We cared. We just figured you'd forgotten. Those simple words stayed with her for the rest of the evening. The next morning, Natalie woke before sunrise. She pulled on her winter boots and walked outside alone. The ranch was silent. Fresh snow covered everything. Only the sound of distant cattle broke the quiet. She wandered toward the old barn. Inside, the same workbench still stood beneath the window. The same shelves. The same smell of wood and machine oil. She ran her hand across the worn surface where she used to spread out sketchbooks after school. Back then she dreamed about designing buildings in cities she had never visited. She smiled. The dream itself had never been the problem. Pretending she had appeared there without a past. That had been. Later that afternoon, the small town held its annual Christmas market. Her mother insisted they go. You'll see everyone. Natalie laughed. That's exactly what worries me. Her mother smiled knowingly. They're not waiting to judge you. They're waiting to hug you. The market filled the main street with lights, music, and food trucks. People recognized Natalie almost immediately. Natalie Reed? I haven't seen you in years. Your mother says you're designing half of Denver now. She laughed. My mother exaggerates. A little. An older woman she barely remembered squeezed her hand. We're proud of you. Natalie thanked her. She realized something strange. No one asked how expensive her apartment was. No one cared about job titles. No one commented on her clothes. They only wanted to know how she was doing. As they walked through the market, a teenage girl approached nervously. Excuse me. Natalie turned. I heard you're a designer. I want to study graphic design too. But the girl hesitated. My guidance counselor says people from around here usually don't make it into that industry. Natalie felt her chest tighten. Years earlier, someone could have said the same thing to her. Instead of giving a quick answer, she asked, What's your name? Emma. Can I show you something? Natalie opened her phone. She pulled up a photo of the county art competition she had found in the barn. The picture of 12-year-old Natalie standing proudly beside her drawings. I was younger than you when this was taken. Emma smiled. You made that? I did. I thought successful designers all came from big cities. Natalie laughed. So did I. The girl looked at her hopefully. So, do you think I have a chance? Natalie smiled. I think where you start matters a lot less than whether you keep going. She reached into her purse and found one of her business cards. On the back, she wrote her email address. When you're putting together your portfolio, send it to me. I'll help if I can. Emma stared at the card. Really? Really? As the girl hurried back toward her parents, Natalie's mother quietly slipped her arm through her daughter's. You just did for her what someone should have done for you. Natalie looked across the snowy town square. Christmas lights reflected off the ice. Children laughed. Neighbors greeted one another by name. She thought about Richard. About the letter. About the first day they had met. For years she had believed that leaving home meant closing a door. Standing there now, she realized something far more important. The door had never been locked. She had simply been afraid to walk back through it. And in just a few weeks, there would be one final event in Denver. One final conversation. One final chance to discover whether the person she had become was truly the person she wanted to be. Spring arrived in Colorado almost overnight. The snow melted from the foothills. Trees along the streets of Denver burst into shades of green. The redevelopment project that had once been little more than a sketch on Natalie's computer was finally complete. The abandoned warehouse district had become something entirely different. Wide sidewalks, local cafes, public art, small bookstores, family-owned restaurants, a park where children now played every afternoon. The city announced an official grand opening celebration. Local television stations planned live coverage. Business leaders, community organizations, city officials, and residents would all be there. Nearly 2 years had passed since the day Natalie had mistaken Richard Brooks for someone who didn't belong. Sometimes it felt like another lifetime. On the morning of the ceremony, Natalie arrived before sunrise. Old habits. She always preferred seeing a project before the crowds appeared. The air was cool. The streets were quiet. She walked slowly through the neighborhood. Every sign, every mural, every bench, every storefront carried small pieces of the design language her team had created. But what made her smile most wasn't the design itself. It was watching the first bakery owner unlock her door. A father walking his daughter to school. A coffee shop employee setting tables outside. The neighborhood was alive. Not because of architecture. Because people had returned. Daniel joined her a few minutes later. He handed her a paper cup of coffee. You still get here before everyone. She laughed. Some habits are worth keeping. He looked around the neighborhood. You know, when we started this project, I thought we were building buildings. And now, we were building trust. Natalie nodded. I think Richard knew that from the beginning. Guests began arriving shortly before 10. Construction workers who had spent 2 years on the site stood beside architects in tailored suits. City council members chatted with local artists. Children ran through the new plaza while musicians tuned their instruments. Natalie loved seeing all of it mixed together. No invisible lines. No separate worlds. Exactly as Richard had envisioned. The ceremony began with applause. Community leaders spoke first. Then neighborhood residents shared stories about what the area had once meant to their families. One elderly man described working in the warehouses nearly 50 years earlier. I never thought I'd live long enough to see this place full again. Many people wiped away tears, including Natalie. When Daniel finished his remarks, he stepped back from the podium. Our final speaker doesn't need much of an introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Brooks. The crowd applauded warmly. Richard walked to the microphone wearing the same style of plaid shirt he always seemed to prefer beneath a simple sport coat. Some things never changed. He looked over the crowd before speaking. I've been asked many times why I invested here. People usually expect a complicated business answer. He smiled. The truth is much simpler. I've always believed communities deserve second chances. He paused. So do people. Natalie lowered her eyes. She knew those words weren't only about the neighborhood. Richard continued. A few years ago, these buildings were overlooked. People drove past them every day without seeing their potential. He gestured toward the renovated district. They weren't useless. They were unfinished. Another pause. I think the same is true of many people. The crowd remained completely silent. We're often judged by our worst day, our first impression, our biggest mistake. But none of those things tells the whole story. Natalie felt a lump rise in her throat. She knew exactly where this was going. Richard looked directly toward her for only a brief second. Not long enough for anyone else to notice. Just long enough for her to understand. If someone gives you an honest opportunity to become better, take it. And if you're in a position to offer someone that opportunity, don't waste it. The applause that followed seemed endless. After the speeches ended, reporters gathered around Richard for interviews. Natalie quietly slipped away toward the edge of the plaza. She preferred watching people enjoy the space instead. A little girl chased bubbles across the fountain. Teenagers filled the outdoor seating area. An elderly couple admired a mural painted by local students. Everything felt complete. A voice interrupted her thoughts. You look happier. She turned. Richard stood beside her holding 2 cups of lemonade. I thought we'd earned something colder than coffee. She laughed. I'd say so. He handed her one. For several minutes, they simply watched the crowd. Finally, Richard spoke. Remember our first meeting? She smiled awkwardly. I'll remember it for the rest of my life. I hope not. She looked at him. I'd rather you remember everything that happened afterward. She thought about that. He was right. For so long she had treated that awful Monday as the defining moment of her life. But it wasn't. It was only the beginning. A young television reporter approached them. Mr. Brooks, would you mind answering one last question on camera? Richard nodded. Of course. The reporter smiled. What accomplishment makes you proudest about this project? Most people expected him to mention the investment, the new businesses, the economic impact. Instead, Richard looked across the plaza, then toward Natalie. My proudest accomplishment. He smiled. Watching people grow. The reporter looked confused. You mean the neighborhood? Richard shook his head gently. The neighborhood, and the people who helped build it. Natalie looked away, embarrassed. He hadn't mentioned her name. He didn't need to. She understood exactly what he meant. And somehow, that made the moment even more meaningful. There was only one chapter left. One quiet conversation that would finally bring everything full circle. A few months after the grand opening, life settled into something that finally felt normal. The frantic deadlines disappeared. The late-night design revisions became less frequent. The project that had consumed nearly 2 years of Natalie's life was now simply part of Denver. People met friends there after work. Children played in the park. Local musicians performed on weekends. Visitors admired the buildings without ever knowing how close the project had come to falling apart before it had even begun. Sometimes, the greatest stories leave no visible trace. One quiet Friday afternoon, Natalie received an email from Caleb. Subject, guess what? She smiled before opening it. Inside was a single sentence. Emma, the high school student you met at the Christmas market, just got accepted into the Colorado School of Design. She wanted me to tell you that your email feedback helped her finish her portfolio. Natalie leaned back in her chair. Without realizing it, the kindness Richard had once shown her had already begun reaching people he would probably never meet. She picked up her phone and sent Emma a short message. Congratulations. You earned this. Never let anyone convince you that your hometown defines your future or limits it. A reply arrived only minutes later. Thank you. Someday I hope I can do the same for someone else. Natalie smiled. That, she thought, was exactly how real change spread. Not through speeches, not through headlines, but one person at a time. That evening, before leaving the office, she walked through the nearly empty studio. The cleaning crew had just arrived. Years ago, she probably would have walked straight past them while thinking about tomorrow's deadlines. Instead, she stopped. Good evening, Luis. The older man looked up from his cart and grinned. Heading home already? Trying to. He laughed. You designers never leave on time. You're probably right. They talked for only a minute. About the weather. About baseball. About how Denver traffic somehow managed to get worse every year. Nothing important. Yet somehow, everything important. As she headed toward the elevator, Luis called after her. You know, when you first started saying hello every morning, I figured you were just trying to be polite. Natalie turned. What changed your mind? He smiled warmly. Now I think you actually see people. She stood there quietly for a moment, then simply said, I'm trying. Luis nodded. That's usually enough. Several weeks later, Richard invited the project team to a small barbecue at his ranch outside Fort Collins. No reporters, no executives, no speeches, just friends. Construction workers stood in line beside architects. Interns played horseshoes with project managers. Daniel somehow lost a cornhole game to two electricians and insisted the scoreboard had been wrong. Laughter echoed across the fields. As the sun began setting behind the front range, Richard walked over carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. I've got something for you. He handed Natalie a small framed photograph. She looked down. It was the picture taken on the day of the groundbreaking ceremony. Not of the stage. Not of the speeches. The photograph showed Richard and Natalie kneeling beside the volunteer as they unloaded the delivery signs together. Neither of them had known someone was taking the picture. Natalie laughed softly. I don't even remember this. Exactly, Richard replied. You weren't thinking about how you looked. You were thinking about helping. He pointed toward the photo. That's why it's my favorite. She looked at it again. The woman in the picture looked relaxed, comfortable, authentic. For the first time in years, she wasn't trying to become someone else. As the evening grew darker, guests slowly began heading home. Natalie walked toward her car, carrying the framed photograph. Richard caught up beside her. You know, I never told you something. She smiled. What? The first day you spoke to me in that studio. I was angry. She looked surprised. I always thought you stayed calm. I looked calm. He laughed. Those aren't always the same thing. She smiled. I guess not. He continued. I almost canceled the project. I know. But if I had. He looked toward the lights glowing across the ranch. This neighborhood wouldn't exist. Caleb might never have joined your team. Emma might never have applied to design school. And you, he paused, might have spent the rest of your life believing you were the worst thing you'd ever done. Natalie's eyes filled with tears. I almost did. Richard nodded gently. I know. As she drove back toward Denver beneath a sky filled with stars, the framed photograph rested on the passenger seat. She thought about the woman she had been, always afraid someone would discover where she came from, always trying to outrun a version of herself that had never been her enemy. Then she thought about who she had become, someone who still made mistakes, still caught herself making unfair assumptions from time to time, still had moments when old habits whispered in the background. The difference was, now she noticed them, and every day, she made a different choice. Because becoming a better person isn't a finish line you cross once. It's a decision you make over and over again. Sometimes quietly, sometimes imperfectly, but always intentionally. Maybe that's the real lesson. Not that first impressions are always wrong, but that they are almost never the whole story. The next person you meet could become your greatest opportunity to learn, or your biggest regret. The difference may come down to something as simple as a greeting, a moment of patience, or the willingness to look beyond a plaid shirt, a worn pair of boots, or an unfamiliar accent. Everyone carries a story you cannot see. And sometimes, the person you're tempted to underestimate today is the very person who will help you become someone better tomorrow.